Thanks a lot, Paul. I'm delighted to see you all here today. I've earned, whether deservedly or undeservedly, a reputation for being slightly maverick, but somebody described me as being Machiavellian in method and pure and noble in intention. So in the questions, I'll take any question you like on any aspect of US strategy, and I will cover the details of US strategy. I will cover in a few sentences in my talk, because I actually want to bring it all together. If we'd had all day, I would have made the talk as a look at 4 documents, which I think are a nice way to work out what everybody's thinking about Afghanistan today. And if we'd had all day, one of the documents, of course, would have been General McChrystal's assessment, his initial assessment of what's going on, which is sort of the thing which triggered the latest reflection on strategy in the US. And for the Afghan voice, I would have looked at the President's inaugural speech made just over a week ago, Karzais' sort of promises for his second round. I would have, for sort of an alternative take as to, a document which sums up what individuals caught up in the business of implementing strategy, what they think. I would have gone to Richard Colvin's testimony before the Canadian Parliamentary Committee, something like 4 or 5 days ago. And I would have come on to the latest European strategy as an account of what we and our friends are supposed to be doing. But I've only got a short bit of time, so what I think I'd like to do is I'm going to start off with the European paper and then give you a few sentences on the other 3 documents, and then we'll move on to the strategy in the questions. Because where we are in the document which in a sense any of us can get hold of here to say what's Europe's position in this very difficult and now controversial war was adopted on the 21st of October. I'm really not quite sure how, in what detail anybody here follows either Afghanistan or Europe in Afghanistan. But if I awaken any interest, download it, get hold of the document, go through it. As somebody having lived through the system, although I haven't actually had to sit like Marie, I haven't had to sit through many actual PSC meetings, and so in the heart of Brussels decision making. I've sort of been more at the field end. It's after all, that's our presence in the world. And this document, which is called "Strengthened EU Action in Afghanistan and Pakistan," is it's the latest vision of what we are supposed to be doing there, and. If I had to sum up what it says, the announcement is perturbed but business as usual, which is sort of a slightly strange reaction given that where I think any of us just sitting here, at least we know where the public debate is, which is deep scepticism verging on alarm. But the official position is business as usual. Our 27 countries are disappointed by the recent controversies, particularly around the presidential election, and they are aware of the deep scepticism at home. But so far, they basically, the governments basically believe that Afghanistan and Pakistan as well are significant for this any idea of global security, and they have basically concluded so far that giving up now, pulling out abruptly, would call into question anything which has been done over the past 8 years. So basically, the signal you get when you look at what Europe is doing coming into the strategy thing is, so far we stay in the game. And I would love to, when sort of thinking out how would you sort of describe in one line a European document? I'd love to sort of resort to literature and say what would be the sort of the Swift or the Beckett description of it. But I would actually go for the title which is there in the archives that you can sort of download from, which is ST14064EN is the best way to describe it. And one of the reasons that I actually actually have a text in front of me so that I can actually directly quote, because some of the direct quotes give a flavour of what we say we are doing. In terms of the catchphrases which are thrown there in the document, we have our strategy as a transition strategy, and it's an important catchphrase, which is sort of a reaction to where we are in this sceptical public debate, because nobody dare propose status quo. We're still frightened of withdrawal, so we say that we have a transition strategy, Of course, everybody says, but transition to what? It's not quite clear yet, and that is something which, again, in the sort of the next round of public debate, everybody's saying, "What do you mean, transition to what?" But it's the phrase that's there. The other key, the catchphrase is turning the page on Afghanistan. Although as somebody who does believe that actually there are reasons why we should continue to try and do something in Afghanistan, one of the reasons that I would feel worried by what we propose is, of course, that I'm not sure that the proposed actions are sufficient to turn the page. They look very much like staying on the same page, reading from the same page that we've been on for quite a while. So anyway, their words rather than ours. In the wherever you come at the public debate on Afghanistan, whether you're in North America or whether you're in Europe, you get onto this whole thing about, is it important? Why are we there? Everybody's asking, and this is there's a paradox behind anybody's strategy making over Afghanistan at the moment, which is a little bit like the banks and the bailouts. The paradox is that we have to be involved because things are so bad. So that, in a sense, the worse you describe them, then the more one of the cases for actually staying there and trying to do something is built up, just like the banks. So, going back to their words, Afghanistan is now entering a decisive period, and I should say, as somebody having worked this portfolio for many, many years, it's always a decisive period. The situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating. We are not only faced with a critical security situation, progress on political form, governance and state building is too slow, and in some parts of the country almost non-existent. So basically, after 8 years of our intervention, we say that the country is barely functional. But of course, then, because that's the bit, it's bad, it's not working. But then the bit about Europe still has to be there. Their words, many of the most serious global threats facing us today can be found in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Terrorism and militant extremism, illegal drugs, transnational crime, and weapons of mass destruction. Instability and insecurity there have a direct impact here in Europe. That's basically the answer to all those who and there are increasingly people questioning, what are we doing there? Why are we there? That's the answer in a nutshell. Long list of problems, the centre of gravity of which actually resides in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, in terms of what we're supposed to be doing, and where I sort of feel that they have this feeling that we are sort of on the same page as we've been for quite a while, is that we've largely proposed carrying on doing what we've been doing for quite a few years. So, I think many of us here would be reassured by the sort of governing statement that insecurity in Afghanistan cannot be addressed by military means alone, and that's the sort of one of the guiding principles for all that we in the EU agree that we'll do together. So we put in €1 billion annually on non-military action, and of course, Europe as the EU is not responsible for the military action because that's governed separately. And so we try and work in governance, rule of law, justice, development, and humanitarian assistance. I mean, you go down through what all the things which are proposed, where I start to ask, are we on the same page? There's been a lot of concern in the public debate, and this is something which I can say spans the debate in the US and in Europe, concern about central government. Yeah, it's a highly centralised system that we helped put back into place. and yet the country seems only to work when it's decentralized. How do you handle it? Well, of course, instinctively you say, let's carry on with our with some investment in local government and decentralization. So we get what's called a focus on the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, IDLG, which with the phrase in the strategy is, we shall ensure that it's truly independent and transparent. And here we get the problems of of foreigners in Afghanistan. Sometimes we have difficulty, getting on top of the minutiae. This thing which they refer to, the body which is supposed to be running local government in the country. The great hope: if central government won't work, let's work with local government. The independent in it is a sort of I hesitate to say joke, but it doesn't have the same kind of meaning. If we had a government body here or a government-related body which were independent, we would have some kind of governance structure for it, thinking that you could point to say this is what gives us its independence. This is a body which was taken out of the Ministry of Interior and put into the President's office with no particular governance structure answering directly to the President's office. In no means can you say it is independent, but it happens to have that label, and we are investing some hope in that label should achieve meaning. Which is a slightly strange way, and we're also in backing that simply cannot address the issue that the local government structure that we're addressing there has got no form of accountability to the population. Zero. It's not me as a maverick exaggerating. It doesn't exist. We shall develop and institutionalize capacity building and take concrete steps towards budget reform. We shall engage in strengthening the subnational governance task force and training of civil servants in core skills such as budgeting, planning and other management skills, as well as supporting public administration studies at the Civil Service Institute. These are the words in the plan. We're fully committed as Europe to bureaucratic development. Unfortunately, cannot yet take into account the point that the national partner has shown no interest whatsoever in pursuing these things and has systematically undermined the development of a bureaucracy or rule-based decision-making or merit-based appointments. And also we seem to have not come up with anything which can address the point that government has lost access to about 50% of its territory. It's business as usual. Democracy. We are obviously, given that we are committed in Europe genuinely to supporting democracy, it has genuinely been troubling that our Afghan partner rigged the presidential elections. The response to that we have in strategy is give priority to supporting a strengthened framework for democratic development with a stronger and more pluralistic political party system and a better functioning parliament. This will be done by supporting EU Parliament activities and the work of European political foundations. And we shall support the 2010 elections. I throw in these quotes from the perspective of somebody who not just believes that Afghanistan is important, that there are things that can be done in Afghanistan, and that an important aspect of what can be done in Afghanistan is democracy. And for me, the idea of democracy in Afghanistan is particularly the pluralist element of democracy. You're helping a country which has been riven by civil war since 1978, and if it reverts into civil war again because we pull out abruptly, then the whole world will basically blame us. We'll be identified, the Europeans and the Americans, as the ones who are the most enthusiastic backers of the bond process in 2001, will be blamed for the restart of that civil war. So getting democracy right is actually an important part of the just mission in Afghanistan. But simply ignoring the fact that our key partners were prepared to undermine democracy by rigging and have systematically marginalised the parliament over the past few years is not going to turn the page. So it's good that there's a mention of democracy, but things are going to have to change. If we're going to have to seriously strengthen the strategy if we actually expect it to change anything. On reconciliation, something which you'll know I have advocated for a long time, the EU will support Afghan-led reintegration measures. the word reintegration is sort of you could say is like the lowest common denominator for measures which have got something to do with reconciliation. Reintegration is what they describe as sort of the deal you offer to combatants who decide that they want to leave the armed struggle. In terms of where the overall debate is on Afghanistan, whether you look at the US or whether you look at Afghanistan itself, in a sense, this is well behind the curve. That there are already many public statements and much thinking going ahead to, is it possible to initiate a sort of a national level political track? Can you bring the leadership of the insurgency into talks? What would a new political deal amongst Afghans, including the people in the insurgency, look like? So far in Europe, we are committed to the absolutely the lowest common denominator on that. And then all the other stuff that we're supposed to be supporting, there's reference to an idea of a new compact. The new compact should include clear and targeted action in fighting corruption, because everybody's talking about corruption at the moment. We've got a drug control strategy, we've got counter-narcotics dialogue, we've got an ongoing commitment to sending police officers who can advise their Afghan counterparts. We're reaffirming the idea of covering the running costs of the police. The EU will continue to give priority to an agreement with the new Afghan government on clear and realistic targets for progress in the justice sector. I could go on with a much longer quote on that. We simply do not recognise that over the past 8 years of wishing for progress in the justice sector, there has been none. There's been little commitment to the idea of an independent judiciary from the executive, and everybody else is grasping with this problem that about 80% of disputes in the country are handled by the non-formal justice system, in a sense outside the courts, which is in some ways sort of a good thing. But it's strange to keep on focusing on a non-functional formal justice system if 80% of the good action is happening away from it. And of course, human rights, in particular women's and children's rights, are at the centre of a strengthened EU political dialogue with the Afghan government, because public opinion within member states is increasingly sensitive to reports of human rights abuses in Afghanistan, as illustrated by the controversy over the Shia law. We've recognised that from our perspective that the human rights are important, and genuinely, I know from the perspective of anybody who's worked on behalf of Europe in Afghanistan that they have genuinely promoted human rights. But we haven't quite come up with a strategy which says what do we do with some of our key partners show little interest in it. We've got ideas of reorganizing Europe and the way it works there. We will, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, work together and coordinate closely with international partners, most notably the US, which plays a dominant role in terms of presence, assistance, and political dialogue. It's in a sense, perhaps the starkest statement of reality in terms of how the Europeans position themselves on an international issue where the United States take the lead is to recognise that the US actually is the dominant player. If you count it by resources, you count it by the military action, if you count it by the leverage over the host government, that is the reality, whether you like it or not. At least we've got some realism. We've got some realism there. Where you come on to the real idea of reorganising is there's talk of a new contract with the Afghan people. You may follow this in the public discussions and the statements that the world leaders have been giving over the past few days and around the inauguration of Hamid Karzai, and the idea is summed up here. This is an opportunity to frame a new agenda and a contract with the Afghan people. That agenda should be supported by a renewed compact between the government of Afghanistan and the international community. This requires, above all, strong Afghan leadership. Attention must now be focused on Afghan state taking full responsibility. The idea behind this is that everybody knows that it's important. Things aren't going well. We admit some responsibility ourselves, but basically feel that the Afghan government has let us down and let its population down. But it's the only government that's around, and so what we'll do is we'll encourage them to basically sit down with us, come up with a set of pledges to which they'll give a political commitment that we'll deliver on this. And there's in one direction there's a commitment to its own population, in the hope that its population will hold them accountable. On the other hand, it's a commitment to their international allies. And you come up with some kind of mechanism process, you come up with benchmarks to say these are the things which you've agreed will be achieved, this is when we'll look at it, and we'll see how you're doing. So it's not just uninformed hectoring, that it's actually sort of nice, systematic, and almost bureaucratic. So how are we doing on the score sheet? On one hand, this looks fine, and in a sense, everybody's buying into it. This is the US and Europe are they're both looking at this. And the Afghans are acknowledging it's going to happen. On the other hand, there is an element of plus ça change, because I myself was part of the process back at the end of 2005, the start of 2006, where we went round a similar set of negotiations in the wake of the parliamentary elections, which were supposed to mark the end of the formal Bonn process to set up institution of government in Afghanistan. Came up with a whole list of benchmarks. Came up with the conference in London to launch them. The document then was supposed to be inspirational. Anybody reading it was supposed to be sort of fired with enthusiasm. Yes, this is something we should be part of. And then we had a monitoring mechanism, which largely, the meaningful benchmarks basically were not met. The insurgency took off almost from the date that the compact was. By coincidence, but by coincidence, the insurgency took off from the date that the compact was launched. And at best, there was fudging in the work on benchmarks subsequently. So that precisely at the time when the government had pledged itself to deliver more, it was actually losing in its ability to govern, because, of course, the insurgency was becoming the reality on the ground. And it seems to be back to the past on this. And there's another bit of whereas it's difficult to see where there really is new thinking coming from either side of the Atlantic on, okay, how do we fix it? In terms of because we've been with compacts, we've been there before. One thing which Europe is starting is pledging to do better is at least to reorganise the slightly arcane relationships inside the European institutions. That the Council and the Commission have been represented separately in countries like Afghanistan where they work together. So there's a pledge to move towards closing that gap. Not actually naming a date yet, but saying we will move towards it. We know where we're going. If we're to be honest, and I should say that a huge amount of work goes into getting agreement even on this kind of thing. And that people have to burn lots of midnight oil to get agreement on this kind of even this kind of deal. But the reality is it's bland and it's inadequate. It's perhaps barely relevant to a crisis which is as acute as what you face in Afghanistan. It's focused on programs which are already underway and haven't yet achieved enough. It doesn't yet have an answer to trying to do something that your partner in the Afghan government is not so seriously committed to. And of course, there's nothing in it to address the security crisis. It basically involves working through a government which has lost access to half its country. Which is why, it's important for us because we're Europeans and committed to making this work, which is why, of course, then you do look across the Atlantic and you do look across to the other strategies to say, will the Americans save us again? If you were to then jump to the first of the other documents, which I referred to at the start, and again, I'd encourage anybody who anybody actually who wants to pursue this properly, download it. You'll find it on the net, and if not, I'll leave copies with the institute here. The document which has started everybody talking about US strategy is covered by this beautiful bland letter. It said, as directed by the reference, my initial assessment is attached. A review of the resources necessary to attain the military campaign plan will be prepared by separate correspondence at a later date. Signed, Stanley A. McChrystal, General, U.S. Army. And it's a fascinating statement of the world that we are in. That this correspondence and the attached confidential documentation with a few bits of redact, of course, are now completely publicly available. And in a sense, what is proposed in the and this is not the overall U.S. strategy document. This is the general's initial assessment, but it's almost revolutionary in its spirit. almost revolutionary. I'm not quite at the level of suggesting to you that General McChrystal himself is a revolutionary. But when you start to read, at least if you compare with the bland stuff that we've got, which was all we could manage to get through the PSE, which is a great achievement even to get that much through, it's revolutionary. They worked out how do we apply the latest counterinsurgency doctrine to Afghanistan, and we all know from Iraq they've had all these scholar generals and lots of eminent people turning counterinsurgency doctrine up on its head and rehashing it, and now trying to apply it. They've redefined their concept of security, trying to think that let's go for we must have population security. We're not just here to protect roads and bridges. Intervention only makes sense if you can actually demonstrate that the Afghan population feels more secure. It's damning in its assessment of the current state of affairs. Goes much further than what Europe says. It is damning in its assessment of previous U.S. military practices, particularly those which have generated civilian casualties, and is absolutely stark in saying that we either change the military practices which have generated civilian casualties, or we're defeated. So you have the prospect. That's why you have same General McChrystal when the Germans managed to kill 100 people in Kunduz over a very strange bombing of a stolen tanker. That the U.S. general basically got on helicopter, flew to the spot, and said mea culpa. There's even a complete overhaul of detention practices, and this weird position of a new military fascination with human rights. I've sat in DC with the briefings by General Stone, who's the person that McChrystal called in to first of all called in to fix Abu Ghraib, and now is called him in to fix detention practices in Afghanistan. And I wish I could communicate with you in the way that General Stone does. Anybody? Mary, have you ever seen General Stone? It's absolutely passionate, wild. That they the PowerPoints are flashing all over the screen, and that the man can absolutely bring the whole audience with you. This is absolutely evangelical preaching. Never rings. Never rings. Yes, absolutely never rings. It's absolutely passionate, and this again for a U.S. general is passionate about saying that we either enforce human rights or we're dead. That 80% of the people who are inside U.S. detention system, they are decent, down to earth, or the Iraqis or Afghans, and they should be out and they should be our friends. What are we doing locking them up? I've talked to many of the U.S. human rights workers who are actually feeling absolutely intimidated, saying, "God, we're going to be co-opted," because they've all been told, come visit the jails, have a look round, see if there's anything else you can tell us. We're all human rights activists just like you. Anyway. The point is, that's all there. Go into read the commander's initial assessment. You'll find all out of that. Of course, there is a very clear path laid out for the development of Afghan security forces with this idea. Nobody wants to use the word exit strategy. In fact, you lose marks if you mention the word exit. But in reality, that's what they're talking about. That within a period of time that nobody's allowed to mention just yet, the idea is Afghan security forces are supposed to replace the international forces on the ground. So McChrystal's there with a strategy for how he's going to make the U.S. presence redundant. And and of course, at the end of it, he's got his several scenarios as to how many U.S. troops he requires, and that's what all the discussion that you will have heard about over the past few weeks. When is Obama going to call on this one, and is he going to play to the left, or is he going to play to the right, or is he predictably going to play somewhere straight down the middle? I will actually start. It's so rare that the thing ever rings. I don't even bother turning it down, but just. So anyway, that's in a sense, that's the document which is driving the US strategy, and which is and this strange leaking process whereby the general has fed this into the thinking and got it leaked, and then we've had somebody leaking in return to get the ambassador to leak back, saying we shouldn't put a single extra troop on the ground until we come up with some better way of dealing with the Afghan government. And it's sort of the kind of thing which is missing in our strategy. And I can tell you that in my interaction with the people in Washington, in State and in the Special Representative's office, that their focus is very much on being how do we act politically so that in working with the Afghan government, which is run by whoever, it's the person chosen by the Afghan people, that we actually get a better deal out of them, and that they're rethinking. They're starting to think in terms of statecraft, which is actually a healthy development. How can we deal with them better? In terms of and just obviously I did tell you I would refer to the two other documents again. If somebody wants to do homework, go and read them. If you want to read the Afghan President's address, available on his website, the one word which I'd use to describe that one would be complacent. Absolutely no sense of crisis. Reading that, you would not get the sense that that NATO in 2006 launched the largest battle it has fought in its whole history, which was in Panjwai in Kandahar. They mustered more military muscle than they've ever deployed, and they went into battle and they took Panjwai, which is next to Kandahar city. Heroic victory. It was General Richard's great victory. Now, if you ask the Canadians, how's Panjwai? They say, we want to go to Panjwai, we have to fight our way there, and we fight our way back. 2.5 years after NATO's most glorious victory, but there is absolutely no sense of that crisis in the president's the president's address. In a sense, it's much more European. If Europe has said we'll do business as usual, the president has also said we'll do business as usual. And the final document I'd refer to and say I'll leave copies over here. If you want to get a sense of what it's like inside, the people who are left actually to deliver these strategies, it never quite works just as you'd expect. And I mention this because this is one that I like. It's good to be passionate. And this Richard Colvin was, in a sense, was my counterpart when I was the EU deputy there. He was the Canadian deputy, and one of about 12 or 15 items in his brief was dealing with detention issues, and particularly the issue of what happened to detainees that the Canadians picked up and then handed over to the Afghan intelligence service. And the concern was, of course, always that they might be badly treated. And this is something which all of us who were engaged and passionate worked on, trying to basically clamp down on torture in Afghanistan in various ways. And one part of the brief was what can you do on torture in general, and another part of the brief was those countries who hand detainees over, what can they do to ensure that those people have adequate safeguards against torture while in custody. This said there's been a storm of controversy in Canada over the past week because as Richard, who's now redeployed, he's working in Washington, was hauled up before a parliamentary committee and obliged under subpoena to testify, and he came out and said that they, as far as I'm concerned, all the people we were handed over were probably tortured. Because the safeguards that we had in place were inadequate, the monitoring was inadequate, that the torture in the institution was routine. This is what we tried to do to stop it. This is where we were blocked. And he has, of course, been targeted by his defence minister over the past week for targets as being unreliable. How would you know that? But the sense is that there is a when you adopt a strategy, the people who are there to deliver it have got to be backed up. And I think it would be great if there's some real lessons from those who make the strategy could be learned by the experience of people like Richard Colvin, because it's actually as a dedicated public servant, he's got a brilliant case study of the weakness of our governmental instruments when you apply them in a difficult country like Afghanistan, and the kind of warning signals which should be observed, because combating torture is something which is important and doable, but it requires persistence and commitment on it. So, anyone who wants to do some background reading and work out what does strategy mean when it's applied, go for Richard Colvin's testimony. Just to wind up, what we should be doing. Initially, I would say that reopening the public discourse at a time when there is so much scepticism would actually be a very positive move. The Canadians actually did do that a couple of years ago with they had a Manley Commission. They basically took an opposition politician and gave him a brief of saying, well, you look at what we're doing, why we're doing it, and take it back to the public and talk about it and see if people actually appreciate that there is a reason for why we should be investing something over there. There's going to be a public debate anyway. I would have thought that people who actually believe that there is something worth doing there are now, I think, that now they are obliged to come clean on what it is and explain it. And I have in the US, I've had a very interesting time doing that. Talking to the US public. I mean, even yesterday on a 1 hour phone-in while sitting in Dundrum, was able to field questions from the U.S. public about what they are doing and what they shouldn't be. But in terms of things which I think we should be doing, first of all, there should be a credible peace process, and I mean, I know that the Americans are buying into this because I talk to them all the time, and I think that their administration is in favour of doing probably a lot more than they're yet. It's not all formulated, but that the instincts which I have seen there are all right. That the administration there cannot afford to look weak on national security. They would far rather be involved in a peace process than involved in a war. So I think that we will see progress on this, and it is important that we should. It would be nice to think that Europe could be more involved in it as well. That we should be supporting a credible peace process, and I think that because there is such, dire. Okay, Ireland's got seven troops in Europe, so it's not in Afghanistan. It's not such a big issue. But in other European countries which have larger contingents and are taking casualties, of course, there is a very deep debate about this. But I think their publics will be more willing to extend the mandate for a little bit yet if they know that this is pointing towards peace rather than occupation of a land that we're not quite sure why we're there. Secondly, broader than just the peace, that the idea of being a peace process which is focused on insurgents, people who have not actually come into the Bonn political process, not been part of what's gone on inside Afghanistan the past few years. There must be a real political strategy, ways of working with stakeholders other than just the government, ways of dealing with the government when it breaks its promises. It's something which has been remarkably absent for the past few years. And in terms of the overall flavour of the intervention, when you follow public debate, particularly in the US, 90% of the public debate is on the military, and yet, even General McChrystal will tell you the military is not going to solve the problems; it's just a holding operation. So, real political strategy is required. Another thing which, if I had a chance to rewrite the way we do business, treat Afghans as adults. In fact, if you could apply the Spanish Inquisition to much of what the international community does in Afghanistan, you could probably tear out much of actually what's being done because it fails to abide by that basic principle: treat Afghans as adults. Much of what passes as institutional capacity building and some of the slightly arcane phrases I quoted to you earlier on, simply ignore our inability to develop capacity in somewhere where we have very limited cultural understanding of it, very few linguists and very few people who actually can interact with the people on the ground. I think it's right that Europe should sustain its development programme. It should have a long-term perspective. It should be focused in particular on the areas where it is possible to work. If the government has lost access to 50% of the country and 50% of Afghanistan, it's perhaps not quite normal, but it's within the bounds of normality of other less developed countries. And finally, overall, I think we should stick to modest objectives, pace ourselves for the long term, and be transparent with our own publics and with our Afghan partners and what it is we're trying to do.
Thank you very much, Michael.